Blog Talk Radio.
Okay, go ahead.
Hello. Welcome to Blog Talk Radio. Tonight is Monday, May the 19th, and tonight we'll be hosting a special roundtable forum with our guest, Ivan Kilgore, author of the book Domestic Genocide, Institutionalization of Society, and chairman of the United Black Family Education Fund. We'll also have on Mr. Levon Hinton. He is the president of Vandem Productions and also producer of the documentary Victims of Circumstance. Gentlemen, go ahead and introduce yourself tonight to the show.
Hey, how you doing, Brother Ray, man? It's great to be here with you tonight. And Ms. Brooks, I'm glad to have the opportunity. I'd like to give a shout-out to everybody and hope everybody's ready to tune in and hear what we got to say.
All right, Mr. Hinton, go ahead and introduce yourself, please, sir, to Free Alabama Movement, Blog Talk Radio.
I first want to, thank everybody for thank Brother Melvin for the opportunity, Brother Ivan, Ms. Brooks, everyone with the Free Alabama Movement. Thank you for having me on your show.
All right, and we're going to be having a special, again, tonight the topic will be mass incarceration, dealing with mass incarceration inside the United States of America. Over 2.5 million people are currently incarcerated. We'll also be looking at the institutionalization of information and knowledge as it's applied to people in society and how that affects people who are incarcerated. And then we'll go inside the prison system and take a look at specifically mass incarceration in the state of Alabama, what that means in 2014 with the lack of opportunities for education, lack of opportunities for rehabilitation. And then we'll go into Free Alabama Movement, what we can do about these things to make change inside the state of Alabama. Why is it important to engage in nonviolent peaceful protests for civil and human rights? And why now is the time? There's a movement all across the United States dealing with mass incarceration. They're protesting in Florida, Texas, Oklahoma, California, New York, Pennsylvania, just all around America because people are fed up with what obviously a modern-day slave system. So tonight we're going to be addressing those topics and more. Even as we had the show tonight, we've learned that there's a young man who's been killed in Arkansas again by police officers, an African-American male, and it's the same old script. They say they thought he was armed, thought he was fixing to try to shoot him. Turns out the man was unarmed, didn't have any kind of weapons, and, he was African-American. And, of course, we've heard this story so many times before over the last several years. So we're going to just continue to take a look at some of these things, how society views the African-American male. Brother Ivan will be talking about that. And we're going to go ahead and get Mr. Ivan on. Go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your book, a little bit about what you do, what the United Black Family is, and just give us some insight into those things, Mr. Kilgore.
Hello? Okay, thank you. So I think the good point to start at is what got me into wanting to write this book and put it out, the title, Domestic Genocide, the Institutionalization of Society.
Hello?
Yes. During the last few months of 2006, I have received a letter from reporter Meredith May of the San Francisco Chronicle. Now, she explained to me that after having reviewed over 100 murder convictions in Oakland, California, my case was one of several that appealed to the Chronicle's interest for a story that would capture the voice of those who had endured the gutter dwellings of Oakland's murderous streets. The setting for these characters, she would later report, was responsible for some 557 homicides within the 5 years prior to the publication's release, making Oakland the state's most murderous city behind Compton. Well, about this time, I had begun to take an interest in writing, so I had signed up for a creative writing class taught here at Folsom Prison. I would spend the next 5 years convening with visiting groups of college professors, media professionals who taught and entertained society's forgotten captives. The misfits who accompanied me in this class were an assortment of writers who ranged from convicted actors to of screenplays, books, poetry, and other forms of literary work. They greatly and to great pains labored with me to develop the ideas that went into this book. Now, while sitting in this class, there were many times that the fear of becoming institutionalized would appear in our writings. We would often write about how the mannerisms and behaviors of prison life work their way into our hearts, minds, and souls. Many of us, we reflected on the rules that had been put to us both behind the brick walls and on the streets. A lot of times our writings reflected how a lot of these rules were designed to maintain the status quo, to whip the powerless, and how most people in society fail to give them any serious consideration. Well, all this got me thinking that if prisoners could so easily become institutionalized, that is, adopt to their setting, its rules, etc., then so too people in the free world, particularly those in the ghetto. This unavoidably forced me to question why it is that people in the so-called free world assume that they are free to make choices and live life independent of the circumstances in which they are raised. We all know that there are exceptions. However, for the most part, most of us are simply prisoners of an environment that we truly don't understand. These environments, very much like prison, shape our views, our beliefs, our reality, and conscience. And they are controlled by those who, unlike us, understand the inner workings of the various social sciences. And because we are ignorant of these sciences, like puppets, I would say we get our strings pulled by forces and circumstances that they create. Well, at this point in my life, I was tired of being a puppet. So long before Meredith had came along, I had been engrossed in learning something of these sciences and how the puppet master pulls our strings with the various institutional structures of racism, education, culture, politics, law, and economics. What I was to gain in time would be profound and consequently cut the strings to the puppet I had become, because up until this point in my life, I was essentially like a baron in one of those pinball machines getting bounced around due to circumstances. So I began to understand how reality was created, how it is exploited, how it controls, and more importantly, how it is designed to kill many of us in the ghetto. Now, it would take me some 7 years to complete this book. Of course, it required of me to do my homework to support my thesis. I immediately recognized when attempting to write this book that there were questions and issues that I had sought to address that would be challenging, given my incarceration and limited resources. So I had to get creative. However, there was one advantage that I had. I was all too familiar with the outcome of the science at the heart of telling my story. I knew all too well the destruction, the disorganization, the oppression, the institutionalization, the violence of the mind and body that was caused by unstable family and community structures, because I grew up in one. So during the course of writing this book, it was interesting that as I got to going down over the years and looking at the chapters, I was able to see that each chapter in the book was a book in itself. You have chapter 1, which product of the ghetto. Chapter 2, afflicted deliberation. Chapter 3, tribalism. Chapter 4, culture of a murderer. Chapter 5, the unorthodox teacher. Chapter 6, which is one of my favorites, the terrible beauty of hip-hop. And, of course, we have chapter 7, which we're really touching on tonight, which is chapter 7, A1 being the web of injustice, chapter 8 being the ZOE. The ZOE now is a common word that we use back home in Oklahoma to describe the prison system. We call it the Twilight Zone, the ZOE for short, due to all the weird things that play out behind these prison fences and walls. And, of course, chapter 9, which is improving their reality. Now, just to give you a brief overview of these chapters, starting with chapter 1, when you think about the ghetto, we're talking about a trap. We're talking about a closed environment that has been socially and economically structured And so it, again, required of me to do my homework. So I got to looking at the history from 1863 on, how beginning with the emancipation of slaves to the 1980s, black Americans, for example, were forced by law, by violence, and by discriminatory government housing policies to live in underdeveloped, segregated communities. My studies showed me that from the New Deal to the 1960s, the federal housing policy encouraged private home ownership for white families, but not blacks. Instead, the federal policy reinforced barriers to residential choice and racially segregating housing that virtually ensured that the quality of housing open to blacks and other people of color was inferior. So, you know, there was a lot that when I got to looking at this and looking at the structure in the community and how they was deprived of certain economic development as far as with the riots and stuff that we know through the history of Tulsa, Oklahoma in the 1920s, for example, Rosewood, what we see is essentially this design that was aimed at keeping a foot on our back. So from this, we had many dysfunctional, you could say, characteristics, habits developed in our community as far as us trying to make it and obtain our piece of the American dream.
Mayor.
Hello?
Mayor.
So,
yeah, someone mute your phone, Mr. Curry. Mute your phone. Just okay. You on? Sorry about that, Mr. Kilgore. Go ahead and finish with your speech.
Okay, so as I was saying, when I'm looking into this history, by 1962, we were talking about the government as far as the Veterans Administration with our returning veterans, the Federal Housing Administration, and how they had financed more than $120 billion in new housing. And here's the trick part about it. Less than 2% was made available to non-white families, most of that on a segregated basis. The housing segregation, we know today, was at the heart of racial inequality. Between 1954 and 1965, more than half of the new industrial buildings, stores, hospitals, and schools were built outside of our communities. The racially segregated and poverty-stricken ghettos, a lot of people say today, and I believe this argument to be true, that exist across America, would not exist today but for these racial-based government policies for which there has never been any meaningful redress. So when we think about that, let's look at our tax legislation. Let's look at how, with our businesses and the exorbitant crime rates and things of this nature, how we really don't have a strong tax base in these communities to support school budgets, for example. Now, we all know that if crime is a product of a poor education, then the manner to which the ghetto's infrastructure has been purposely structured to provide little to tax for school budgets clearly indicates a design intent on fostering crimogenic conditions. Now, when I think about this, as I began to do my studies and go through these chapters, I thought about and I reflected on how this impacts us as people, how we are essentially, by these various institutions, certain behaviors within us are created. And I got to thinking about our social structures. Well, if we think about it, that is our environment to say, it is the result of institutional forces that affect people in negative ways. Take, for example, our prison system. Arguably, the positive aspect that's always put out there is that prisons in American society have been said to remove criminal elements from the community. But the fact of the matter is over 60% of homicides go unsolved. 90% of property crimes go unsolved, and a large number of rapes and other crimes as well. So that really doesn't carry weight. Now, the downside, when we talk about mass incarceration of black males, for example, it destabilizes our families and our social networks. The lineage of Yes, sir.
Mr. Kilgore, I don't mean to interrupt you. You just said some statistics. I did want to interject and ask a question because I think you said something very important. You said 60% of homicide crimes go unsolved?
Yes.
And what were the other crimes? You gave two more crimes. What percentages and what were those crimes again?
Your property crimes, like your burglary, things of that nature.
And what percentage of those
crimes go unsolved?
Okay. The reason why. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. In proportion to that, the crimes that are solved that they do prosecute, do they give a specific number on where these unsolved crimes are occurring? Are they saying that these crimes are occurring inside the African American community, outside the African American community? Where are they saying these unsolved crimes, or does that information show that?
No, it basically just speaks in general.
Okay, all right. So it doesn't specify. Okay, it doesn't specify.
No, it doesn't.
Okay, all right.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't specify. So it really brings up the topic of public safety. If we're talking about public safety, the fact of the matter is, 6 out of 10 homicides go unsolved. That means 6 out of 10 killers are walking around on the street.
Correct.
Their neighbors.
Correct.
So the trip part about that, and these are statistical facts that you can go online and find. These are facts that are provided by your Federal Bureau of Investigation and other government agencies. But the problem is the information, as far as people being aware of this. They're not conscious because, as we know, a lot of people are caught up in their daily lives like many of us were before we landed in this situation that we're in now and had all this time to sit down and look at it and think on it.
Okay.
So when you look at the list of social and economic problems that come from a lot of these structures, what happens, for example, with mass incarceration of black males and how that affects the family and community is when you remove a provider from the home, when you remove a parent figure from the home. Now, a lot of people argue and say, well, you were selling drugs, you was doing this, you was doing that. But the fact of the matter is, we put that to the side. That money was making sure the food was on the table and the lights and the bills was being paid. Now you want to talk about welfare. You want to talk about all of that stuff coming in. But more importantly, let's talk about that cycle of dysfunction that's going to perpetuate due to the fact that that parent is not there to teach that child from his or her mistakes. So again, what you have here on a collective level, on a community level, is that our effectiveness as a community, as a family unit, has been broken down by this mass targeting of African American males in the African American community. So when you see a lot of the problems, like I hear people say, these youngsters out here on the streets, they ain't got no manners, they ain't respectful, this, that, and the third. Well, their daddies is locked up. Their mamas is locked up. So who was there to teach them? See, they call this an informal social control because the parent is the first teacher of the child. And if that parent is not there to teach that child, then that child is going to be raised by the streets. And we all know what goes on the street. Anything goes. So
True that.
The important thing that we should look at here is how, for example, when our collective effectiveness is broke down, we have situations like Hurricane Katrina, to where we as a people cannot even pull ourselves up and assist ourselves or others out of some crisis or devastating situation because the various institutional forces have assailed us to the point to where we don't have no men out there in the community to help these women, to help the young brothers and sisters. Because, 1 out of 3 African American males in between the ages of 15 and 24 will be incarcerated? This is what we're dealing with here. So when we look at other American institutions, it's pretty much the same scenario. The educational institution, which is the topic of Chapter 5, the unorthodox teacher, creates scores of poorly functioning ghetto youth. In the terms of political gamesmanship, the school-to-prison pipeline that we've been hearing about has been highly effective. We often hear that chance favors the prepared mind. However, the only thing that ghetto youth are being prepared for is this school-to-prison pipeline. And from projects to prison, the educational experience that they are having, it is essentially incapacitating them. It's making puppets of them. Not only them, but the entire American population, because we really got to look at this thing that we call education, because in reality, it's not education, it's training. It's to sit you on the grid to support, not your own endeavors in the sense of going out and being independent of the existing economic structure, but to make you a component of that structure. So, without question, I believe that a lot of the institutions that we have in America have a profound effect on our social and economic structures, and they tend to take shape in our respective environments. In most cases, say, for example, in the perfect world, these structures are supposed to be the building blocks of communities to accomplish, for example, our socialization, production and distribution of economic goods, the informal and formal social controls that I mentioned earlier, and regulation of reproduction of wealth, and the organization of religion and other value systems. However, in these impoverished and ghetto communities, it's entirely a different thing. Our social structures are designed to dismantle blocks, to reproduce poverty generation after generation. And the only goods that we produce are the drugs that are allowed into our community, the prostitution that our mothers and sisters are forced into to feed their children, and their addictions, and the other crimes that we commit just to get our piece of the American dream. So, consequently, our informal social controls are weakened because daddy is either dead or locked up. And the only religion that we practice is self-preservation, that is, to kill or be killed. Now we're caught up in this trap. And once in this trap, it becomes something that, for men such as ourselves, Melvin and other brothers, we have to sit down and look at, okay, how did I get here? And if we're being honest with ourselves, we're questioning our beliefs. We're questioning the various value systems that have been put to us out there in our community, and how various cultures, violence, drug economy, and so forth have misled us. And then we want to ask the question of where these cultures and institutions come from.
That's true. And I was going to say, you had spoke about the lack of the men being in the community, and the lack of the teacher, the mother being there for various different reasons. And we're talking about, then when you got to the point of education, when you, inside your book where you talk about the institutionalization of society, I know you're going to get to it, but I want to kind of get a clear picture so people understand, when you have a broken family structure, the mother and father is not there, not around, or not equipped to do the job. When you have a targeted assault on the community through institutionalization of people with information, I want you to speak to that, because specifically here in Alabama, there's a 53% of the people who are incarcerated in the Alabama Department of Corrections are black. 80% of all people who enter the Department of Corrections are functionally literate. So when you talk about the background that you're talking about coming from with the broken family structure, with the institutionalization of society and the targeting of specific communities for this institutionalization process, I think that you really don't have a choice but for 1 in 3 black men to go to prison. So could you just kind of give us some enlightenment on what institutionalization of society looks like? How is this going? You know, how do people know when they're being victimized to this?
Well, when you think about the impact of globalization, for example, in the 80s, the 90s, we've seen a lot of jobs go overseas that were outsourced. Well, these jobs were the source of income for urban centers. These jobs were particularly the low-wage, minimum requirement type of jobs where people could go in and earn a decent living for themselves. They may not have been rich or was able to get rich, but they was able to provide for them families and so forth. So when that was removed, and now we're talking about the political aspect with the Contra scandals and the various foreign policies that we have in other nations where, for example, in Central America at this particular time, we were, our businessmen here, the corporations were aiming at acquiring third world quasi-slave labor to man the factories, the textile factories and whatnot. So that went our jobs. Well, with the different groups that you had down there, like the Contras and whatnot, these struggles, in which they had in funding their guerrilla efforts to overthrow these different communist regimes, and how I'm saying all this to how it affected us in our community. Well, they had to fund their guerrilla wars by bringing drugs into our community. And it was just so happened at that time our jobs were going overseas, and here it is, you have a man who has a family, who has responsibilities, and he wants to provide because he has this deep sense of being a provider instilled in him, that his opportunity now becomes a gun or a bundle. And when I say a bundle, I mean a bundle of dope. He perceives this. Now you have a whole generation of youngsters who coming up and think that opportunity for them is drugs, because drugs equate money, and no matter how you get money in American society, it is praised. It is idolized. So now you have this culture of fast money, get money enthusiasts who don't see the harm in their activities as far as being in the community, selling drugs, going to prison. It becomes a badge. It becomes a culture to where a lot of them are oblivious to the domestic genocide, how they're killing each other off, how they're basically puppets on the string out there. And so when you have a young man who's growing up in all of this, his whole value system is being manipulated. He's being told that it's okay to do this because no matter how you get it, the fact that you get it and you put it on the table, there's nothing wrong with that. And in a lot of cases, you know, we tend to grab the dog by the tail and saying, okay, we're looking at what he did and not what drove him to do what he did. Did he have a choice in it? Well, that goes back to our education. When you don't have the prerequisite of quality education to make decisions with justice, to rationalize the consequences of your behavior, or you put in a tight squeeze to where, hey, it's either this, the welfare line, or going hungry, then, you know, you go get it how you live. You go do what you got to do. And a lot of times what we see is that these beliefs, they're not just being manipulated far as with the individual who's out there. It's also with society, people from the outside looking in. You have people who are looking at these young men, who are looking at them as if they are predators and things of that nature. And they don't understand how it is that their belief system has been manipulated to essentially dehumanize these people, to say, okay, you're entitled to what you got coming or what you did. You deserve what happened to you. They don't care nothing about the circumstances of what you went through or how you got to this point or the fact that criminals are made, not born. They don't care. They look over. Just last week, I had a visiting group of college students that came in that I was speaking to, and their whole thing was, okay, we don't want to really get into the whole aspect of how and why crime persists in American society. We just want to talk about at the point that you come into prison, how can we better manage you? So basically, when we think about how, for example, the various aspects of how the criminal, for example, is dehumanized. Let's look at that. Let's talk about that process and the whole transformation process in which people tend to not look at these individuals as fathers, uncles, and so forth, but whatever crime they've been convicted of. And so I think one of the important things that we look at is the premise in which this prison institution has been built upon. Undoubtedly, it stems from the old institution of slavery, because when we look at a lot of the practices in prison, they have been designed to alienate and dehumanize not only the prisoner from himself, but his or her family and society as well. It is the social death of the prisoner, we can honestly say, that most authorities ultimately seek. They seek to strip the prisoner of his or her alienable rights. The symbolic aspect of that, when you take away the right that you have, for example, to redress, the right to a fair trial. You think many people say, well, you have these rights when you go to trial, this is what you get. Well, we already know in Americans' criminal justice system, it's a matter of money. This is not a system that was designed to facilitate justice for the poor, for the working class. And what we have when a lot of people go into this system and they have been stripped of these rights, they fall into this labeling. And the labeling aspect of it is where, with the language and the culture that is typically goes unconscious, many people are not aware of how it is we are transformed from human beings to a murderer, to a thief. And that's all people see. They don't see you as the man. They don't see you as the individual who was out there taking care of his family the best way he could. All they see is the fact that you have been convicted and that you are now a prisoner. So therefore, you have no legitimacy whatsoever. Now,
okay,
Mr.
Ivan, Mr. Kilgore, I'm gonna cut you off here for a minute. I did want to get our second guest on, and I wanted to stop you right there at that point because I think this will transition into Victims of Circumstance, what his documentary is about, Mr. Vandem.